Let's launch right into a fascinating investigative deep dive into the textual preservation of ancient documents. For this explainer, we're basing our analysis on the rigorous work of historian Wesley Huff. He's an expert in ancient literary culture and New Testament manuscripts, and we're going to treat this almost like a historical cold case. We're looking at the raw data, the physical evidence, and even the psychology of ancient witnesses to see exactly how historians argue these texts actually hold up under the microscope of modern historiography.
Okay, let's look at the docket for our investigation today. We're covering 5 main areas: getting closer to the original texts, evaluating ancient historical records, investigating resurrection claims, spotting the ancient fakes, and finally, the mechanics of faith. Section 1. Closer to the original. Let's just dive right into the physical evidence and how historians actually track the chain of custody for texts over thousands of years.
So to start, we really need to challenge a super common assumption. You know that old game of telephone, where a message gets completely mangled by the end of the line? A lot of people naturally assume ancient texts work the exact same way, and that older English translations are inherently closer and therefore much more accurate to the original source text. But according to the source material, the actual data reveals a completely different story.
This is where we see a massive paradigm shift. Think about this. When the King James Bible was translated back in 1611, scholars were relying on Greek texts built from roughly 31 manuscripts, and most of those only dated back to the 11th century. But fast forward to today, historians have literally unearthed and analyzed over 5,000 additional older Greek manuscripts thanks to massive discoveries like the papyri and the Dead Sea Scrolls. So even though chronologically we're further away from the events, the sheer volume of new data actually puts modern translations much, much closer to the original wording.
And this is a brilliant illustration of why updating translations is absolutely essential. Take the story of Elijah and the prophets of Baal from the King James text. Elijah asks the crowd, "How long will ye halt?" Well, today, halt just means to stop abruptly, right? But in Elizabethan English, it actually meant to be physically disabled or to limp. He was essentially asking, how long will you limp back and forth between two opinions? Without a modern translation, that profound historical metaphor is totally lost on us today.
Which brings us to a really crucial point from historian Wesley Huff. He says the English Bible is changed for the sake of clarity, not corruption. Actually, modernizing the text doesn't corrupt the history at all. It actively recovers the true historical meaning of words that have just naturally drifted over centuries of linguistic evolution.
Section 2. Evaluating ancient historical records. So now that we've got a handle on the manuscripts, let's see how historians weigh the actual timelines of these records.
When we compare historical timelines, it's pretty eye-opening. Look at Alexander the Great. The first comprehensive biography of his life, written by Arrian, comes about 450 years after he lived. And yet, historians largely trust those details because waiting centuries for a biography was totally normal in antiquity. But when you juxtapose that with Jesus of Nazareth, where the biographical records emerge within just a few decades, you have a documentary gap that Huff argues is incredibly close to the actual cultural memory of the events.
Section 3. Investigating the resurrection claims. Now we have to turn our investigation toward human psychology, specifically witness behavior following a really traumatic public execution.
Historians love looking at comparables. So take Simon Bar Kokhba. He led a massive messianic revolt in the ancient world, but when he died, his movement just completely died with him, vanished. But with Jesus of Nazareth, who was publicly crucified, the ancient texts report that his disciples went from hiding in a locked room in absolute terror to suddenly preaching at ground zero in Jerusalem just weeks later. Historians really have to account for what could have possibly triggered this sudden explosion of a movement right at the scene of the crime.
Now you might be thinking, well, people die for lies all the time, but look closely at this comparison from the source material. Modern extremists, like suicide bombers, they willingly die for an inherited belief. It's passed down to them through history. They believe it's true, but they didn't witness it. The early apostles, on the other hand, faced brutal executions for an event they claimed to have seen with their own physical eyes. The argument here is that liars actually make terrible martyrs, because it is incredibly rare for someone to willingly go to their grave for something they objectively know is a fabricated lie. So, logically speaking, analyzing these claims brings us straight to C.S. Lewis's famous trilemma. The source material points out that historians are left with a very narrow set of psychological categories here. 1. He was a liar who knew his claims were completely false. 2. He was a lunatic, totally deluded but sincere. Or 3. He was exactly who he claimed to be, and the historical claims were objectively true. The way those early followers behaved absolutely forces historians to grapple with these 3 distinct categories.
Section 4. Spotting the ancient fakes. Look, Every good investigation involves spotting the counterfeits. Let's look at the documents that didn't make the cut.
To spot the fakes, we have to talk about Gnosticism. It's a stark contrast to the texts we just covered. It comes from the Greek word gnosis, meaning knowledge. Gnosticism was basically a philosophical system sweeping in from the East. It claimed that salvation comes from secret, innate knowledge, and it viewed the physical body and the material world as inherently evil, like a prison.
Because early Christianity was getting so popular, these Gnostic groups tried to appropriate the historical Jesus enforcement to their own philosophical framework. And these alternative texts throw up some massive historical red flags. They were written way after the historical figures died. They suddenly portrayed Jesus as this pagan mystic whispering secret codes to obscure figures rather than a rabbi teaching publicly. They entirely deny his physical incarnation, and they sideline all the core apostles. Let's look at a couple of the wildest examples found at Nag Hammadi back in 1945. You've got the Gospel of Thomas, which is basically 114 secret sayings that ends with this incredibly bizarre claim that women have to make themselves male to enter heaven. Then there's the Gospel of Peter, which actually features a floating, non-physical Jesus on the cross. Early church leaders explicitly warned about how absurd and heretical these texts were centuries before physical copies were ever even dug up, which scholars like Huff say completely confirms their historical unreliability. Finally, Section 5, the mechanics of faith. Let's look at the theological mechanics of how the ancients understood human interaction with all of this evidence. We kind of have this modern idea that faith is just a blind leap into the dark, totally devoid of evidence. But in the original Greek context of these manuscripts, the word is pistis, and that translates equally to both faith and trust. It functions a lot more like trusting a spouse based on the weight of their proven character and the evidence right in front of you, rather than just closing your eyes and crossing your fingers.
But here's the catch. The source material notes that, theologically speaking, processing all this isn't viewed as just an intellectual exercise. The ancient texts describe this conversion as a monergistic act, meaning it's entirely a work of God. It's described as actively replacing a heart of stone with a heart of flesh, fundamentally empowering a person to perceive spiritual reality differently. So the theology argues it actually requires an active intervention to truly see and trust the data. And that brings us to the core of this explainer. We've dug into the manuscript data, the historical timelines, the really unique psychological behavior of the witnesses, and how to spot the fakes. But as we wrap up, we're left to ponder a really profound question. If the rigorous demands of historical evidence bring us right up to the door, does human nature ultimately require us to step beyond mere facts and into the active realm of personal trust to actually walk through it? Definitely something to think about as you weigh the evidence for yourself. Thanks for joining me for this explainer.